The Battle of Shiloh, a turning point in the American Civil War. The Battle of Shiloh, fought on April 6 to 7, 1862, in southwestern Tennessee, was one of the bloodiest and most consequential engagements of the American Civil War. It marked a turning point in the conflict, demonstrating the war's escalating brutality and the importance of strategic planning, logistics, and resilience. The battle, also known as the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing, pitted Union forces under Major General Ulysses S. Grant against the Confederate Army of Mississippi, commanded by General Albert Sidney Johnston and, after Johnston's death, General P.G.T. Beauregard. The outcome of the battle had far-reaching implications for the Western theater of the war and set the stage for future Union advances into the Deep South. Background and context: the strategic importance of the Western theater. By early 1862, the Civil War had entered a critical phase. While much of the public's attention was focused on the Eastern theater, particularly the struggle between the Union Army of the Potomac and the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, the Western theater emerged as a vital arena for determining the war's outcome. Control of the Mississippi River and its tributaries was essential for both sides. The Union sought to split the Confederacy in two and gain access to key Southern resources, while the Confederacy aimed to defend its heartland and maintain its supply lines. Union advances in the West. In February 1862, Union forces achieved significant victories at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in Tennessee, opening the way for further advances into the Confederacy. Major General Ulysses S. Grant, who had commanded the successful campaigns at these forts, became a rising star in the Union Army. His aggressive tactics and determination to press the advantage earned him both admiration and criticism. After the fall of Fort Donelson, Confederate forces withdrew to Corinth, Mississippi, a critical railroad junction connecting the Mississippi River to the Atlantic coast. Corinth became a focal point for both sides, as its capture would give the Union control over vital transportation networks and further isolate Confederate forces in the West. Confederate preparations. Recognizing the strategic importance of Corinth, Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston concentrated his forces in the area. Johnston, a respected commander with a distinguished military career, faced the daunting task of organizing a disparate army composed of inexperienced troops and limited resources. Despite these challenges, Johnston was determined to strike a decisive blow against the Union forces before they could consolidate their gains. The armies gather at Shiloh. Union forces at Pittsburgh Landing. In late March 1862, Grant's Army of the Tennessee advanced to Pittsburgh Landing, a small settlement on the west bank of the Tennessee River, approximately 20 miles north of Corinth. Grant established a base of operations there, awaiting reinforcements under Major General Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio. Grant's forces, numbering around 40,000 men, were encamped in a relatively disorganized manner, with little attention paid to defensive fortifications. Grant believed that the Confederates were not yet prepared to launch an attack and focused instead on training his raw troops. Confederate plans for an offensive. Johnston, however, had other plans. Determined to seize the initiative, he decided to launch a surprise attack on Grant's army before Buell's reinforcements could arrive. On April 3, 1862, Johnston's Army of Mississippi, comprising approximately 44,000 men, began its march from Corinth to Pittsburgh Landing. The Confederate plan was to strike quickly and decisively, driving Grant's forces into the Tennessee River and reclaiming the initiative in the Western Theater. The battle begins, April 6, 1862. The Confederate surprise attack. In the early hours of April 6, 1862, Confederate forces launched their attack on Grant's unsuspecting army. The Union troops, caught off guard, were initially overwhelmed by the ferocity and speed of the Confederate assault. Fighting raged throughout the day, with intense combat occurring in areas that would become infamous, such as the Hornet's Nest, a sunken road defended stubbornly by Union troops under Brigadier General Benjamin Prentiss. The death of Albert Sidney Johnston. One of the most significant moments of the first day of battle was the death of General Albert Sidney Johnston. While leading a charge against Union positions, Johnston was struck in the leg by a bullet, severing an artery. Unaware of the severity of his wound, Johnston bled to death within minutes. His death was a devastating blow to the Confederate cause, as he was one of their most experienced and capable commanders. Command of the Confederate forces passed to General P.G.T. Beauregard, who continued the attack but struggled to maintain the momentum. Johnston had established Union resilience and the arrival of reinforcements. Despite the initial Confederate success, Union forces managed to hold key positions and prevent a complete rout. Grant, displaying his characteristic determination, organized a defensive line near Pittsburgh Landing and rallied his troops. As night fell, the fighting subsided, but the arrival of Buell's reinforcements during the night bolstered Union strength and morale. The second day, April 7, 1862. Union counterattack. On the morning of April 7, Grant launched a counterattack with his reinforced army. The fresh troops from Buell's Army of the Ohio, combined with the remnants of Grant's forces, turned the tide of the battle. Confederate troops, exhausted from the previous day's fighting and lacking reinforcements, were gradually pushed back. Confederate withdrawal. By the afternoon, it became clear that the Confederate position was untenable. Beauregard ordered a retreat, and the Confederate army withdrew to Corinth. The Union forces, though victorious, were too exhausted and disorganized to pursue the retreating Confederates effectively. Aftermath and significance. Casualties and losses. The Battle of Shiloh was one of the bloodiest engagements of the Civil War up to that point. Union casualties totaled approximately 13,000, killed, wounded, or missing, while Confederate losses were around 10,700. The sheer scale of the carnage shocked both the North and the South, dispelling any lingering illusions that the war would be short or relatively bloodless. Strategic implications. The Union victory at Shiloh secured control of western Tennessee and paved the way for future advances into Mississippi and the Deep South. The battle also solidified Grant's reputation as a tenacious and capable commander, despite criticism of his initial lack of preparedness. For the Confederacy, the loss at Shiloh was a significant setback. The death of Albert Sidney Johnston deprived the South of one of its most talented generals, and the failure to defeat Grant's army allowed the Union to maintain its momentum in the Western Theater. Legacy of Shiloh. The Battle of Shiloh marked a turning point in the Civil War, demonstrating the importance of logistics, preparation, and resilience. It also foreshadowed the increasingly brutal nature of the conflict, as both sides realized that victory would require immense sacrifice and determination. The Battle of Shiloh. Key strategic decisions by Ulysses S. Grant and Albert Sidney Johnston. The Battle of Shiloh, fought on April 6 to 7, 1862, near Pittsburgh Landing in Tennessee, was one of the most significant and bloody engagements of the American Civil War. It marked a turning point in the Western theater of the war and had profound implications for the strategies and leadership of both the Union and Confederate forces. The battle pitted the Union Army of the Tennessee, commanded by Major General Ulysses S. Grant, against the Confederate Army of Mississippi, led by General Albert Sidney Johnston. The decisions made by these two commanders before and during the battle were critical in shaping its outcome and the subsequent course of the war. This article will explore the key strategic decisions made by Grant and Johnston during the Battle of Shiloh, analyzing their impact on the battle's progression and ultimate result. We will examine the pre-battle preparations, the initial Confederate assault, the Union defense and counterattack, and the aftermath of the battle. Through this analysis, we will gain a deeper understanding of the military leadership and strategic thinking that defined one of the Civil War's most pivotal moments. Chapter 1. The strategic context of the Battle of Shiloh. The Western theater in early 1862. By early 1862, the Civil War had been raging for nearly a year, and the Western theater had become a critical battleground for both the Union and the Confederacy. The Union had achieved significant victories at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in February 1862, which opened the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers to Union control and forced the Confederates to retreat from Kentucky and much of Tennessee. These victories were largely due to the aggressive tactics of Ulysses S. Grant, who had emerged as one of the Union's most effective commanders. The Confederate leadership, recognizing the importance of the Western theater, sought to regain the initiative and halt the Union's advance. General Albert Sidney Johnston, the commander of Confederate forces in the West, was tasked with organizing a counteroffensive to reverse the Union's gains and protect the vital Confederate stronghold of Corinth, Mississippi. The importance of Corinth, Mississippi, was a strategically significant railroad junction that connected the Memphis and Charleston Railroad with the Mobile and Ohio Railroad. Control of Corinth would allow the Union to threaten the Confederate heartland and disrupt supply lines, while the Confederates needed to hold Corinth to maintain their defensive position in the West. Both sides recognized the importance of Corinth, and it became a focal point of their strategic planning. Grant's advance to Pittsburgh Landing. Following the victories at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, Grant's Army of the Tennessee advanced southward along the Tennessee River, eventually establishing a base at Pittsburgh Landing, about 20 miles north of Corinth. Grant's objective was to prepare for an advance on Corinth, but he needed to consolidate his forces and await reinforcements before launching the attack. Grant's decision to encamp at Pittsburgh Landing was based on several factors. The location provided easy access to the Tennessee River, which served as a vital supply line for the Union Army. Additionally, the terrain around Pittsburgh Landing offered natural defensive positions, including high ground and dense woods, which could be used to protect the Union forces from Confederate attacks. However, Grant's decision to encamp at Pittsburgh Landing also had significant risks. The Union Army was spread out over a large area, with divisions positioned in separate camps that were not well fortified. This lack of defensive preparations would later prove to be a critical vulnerability when the Confederates launched their surprise attack. Johnston's plan to attack Grant. General Albert Sidney Johnston recognized the opportunity to strike Grant's army before it could be reinforced and launch an offensive against Corinth. Johnston's plan was to concentrate his forces and launch a surprise attack on Grant's encampment at Pittsburgh Landing, with the goal of driving the Union Army back into the Tennessee River and regaining the initiative in the Western Theater. Johnston's decision to attack Grant was based on several strategic considerations. First, he believed that a decisive victory over Grant's army would not only halt the Union advance but also boost Confederate morale and potentially lead to the recapture of lost territory. Second, Johnston was aware that Grant's forces were not yet fully concentrated and that reinforcements under Major General Don Carlos Buell were en route. By attacking before Buell's arrival, Johnston hoped to defeat Grant's army in detail. Johnston's plan required careful coordination and secrecy. He needed to concentrate his scattered forces, which included troops from various Confederate commands, and move them into position without alerting the Union Army. The success of the attack would depend on the element of surprise and the ability of the Confederate troops to execute a coordinated assault. Chapter 2. The Confederate attack on April 6, 1862. The Confederate march to Shiloh in late March and early April 1862. Johnston began concentrating his forces at Corinth, Mississippi. The Confederate Army, which would later be known as the Army of Mississippi, consisted of approximately 44,000 men, organized into 4 corps under the command of Generals Braxton Bragg, Leonidas Polk, William J. Hardee, and John C. Breckinridge. Johnston's plan was to march his army northward from Corinth to Pittsburgh Landing, a distance of about 20 miles, and launch a surprise attack on Grant's encampment. The march began on April 3, but it was plagued by delays and poor coordination. The Confederate troops were inexperienced, and the muddy roads slowed their progress. Despite these challenges, Johnston remained determined to press forward with the attack. The element of surprise. One of the key elements of Johnston's plan was the element of surprise. He believed that a sudden, overwhelming assault on Grant's unprepared forces would lead to a decisive victory. To achieve this, Johnston ordered his troops to maintain strict silence during the march and to avoid any actions that might alert the Union Army to their presence. However, the element of surprise was compromised by several factors. First, the slow progress of the Confederate march meant that the Union pickets had more time to detect the approaching enemy. Second, there were several skirmishes between Confederate and Union patrols in the days leading up to the battle, which raised suspicions among the Union commanders. Despite these warning signs, Grant and his subordinates did not believe that a large-scale Confederate attack was imminent. The initial Confederate assault on the morning of April 6, 1862, the Confederate Army launched its attack on Grant's encampment at Pittsburgh Landing. The assault began at dawn, with the Confederate forces advancing in 3 lines, led by General William J. Hardee's corps, followed by Braxton Bragg's corps, and supported by Leonidas Polk's and John C. Breckinridge's corps. The initial Confederate assault caught the Union forces completely by surprise. Many Union soldiers were still in their camps, preparing breakfast, when the Confederate attack began. The Union pickets were quickly overwhelmed, and the Confederate troops advanced rapidly, driving the Union forces back toward the Tennessee River. Grant's response to the attack. Despite the surprise and confusion caused by the Confederate assault, Grant quickly took command of the situation. He ordered his divisions to form defensive lines and hold their ground, while he sent urgent messages to Major General Don Carlos Buell, whose Army of the Ohio was approaching from the north, to hasten his arrival. Grant's decision to hold his ground and organize a defense was critical in preventing a complete Union collapse. He recognized that retreating to the river would leave his army vulnerable to being cut off and destroyed. Instead, he ordered his troops to establish a defensive perimeter around Pittsburgh Landing, using the natural terrain to their advantage. The Hornets' Nest. One of the most famous episodes of the Battle of Shiloh was the defense of the Hornets' Nest, a sunken road surrounded by dense woods, where Union troops under the command of Brigadier General Benjamin M. Prentiss and Brigadier General W.H.L. Wallace made a determined stand against repeated Confederate assaults. The Hornets' Nest became a focal point of the battle, as Confederate forces under Generals Bragg and Breckinridge launched multiple attacks in an attempt to break through the Union line. The Union defenders, despite being heavily outnumbered, held their ground for several hours, inflicting heavy casualties on the Confederate attackers. The defense of the Hornets' Nest bought valuable time for Grant to reorganize his forces and prepare for a counterattack. However, the Union position was eventually overwhelmed, and Prentiss and Wallace were forced to surrender. Despite this setback, the prolonged defense of the Hornets' Nest had a significant impact on the battle, as it delayed the Confederate advance and allowed Grant to consolidate his defenses. Johnston's death and the Confederate command. One of the most significant events of the first day of the Battle of Shiloh was the death of General Albert Sidney Johnston. Johnston had been personally leading the Confederate attack, riding along the front lines to rally his troops. During one of these rides, he was struck by a bullet in the leg, severing an artery. Johnston initially did not realize the severity of his wound and continued to lead his troops until he collapsed from blood loss. He died shortly thereafter, and command of the Confederate Army passed to General P.G.T. Beauregard. Johnston's death was a major blow to the Confederate cause. He was one of the South's most experienced and respected commanders, and his loss had a demoralizing effect on the Confederate troops. Beauregard, who assumed command, was a capable officer, but he lacked Johnston's charisma and strategic vision. The change in command would have significant implications for the outcome of the battle. Chapter 3, The Union Counterattack on April 7, 1862. The arrival of Buell's army. One of the key factors that turned the tide of the Battle of Shiloh was the arrival of Major General Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio on the evening of April 6. Buell's forces, numbering approximately 17,000 men, had been marching to reinforce Grant's army, and their arrival provided a critical boost to the Union defense. Grant and Buell coordinated their efforts to launch a counterattack on the morning of April 7. The Union forces, now reinforced and reorganized, began to push back against the Confederate lines. The Confederate troops, exhausted from the previous day's fighting and demoralized by the loss of Johnston, were unable to withstand the Union assault. Grant's decision to counterattack. Grant's decision to launch a counterattack on April 7 was a bold and decisive move. Despite the heavy losses suffered by his army on the first day of the battle, Grant recognized that the Confederate forces were also weakened and disorganized. By taking the offensive, Grant aimed to regain the initiative and drive the Confederates from the field. Grant's counterattack was supported by the arrival of Buell's army, which provided the necessary reinforcements to turn the tide of the battle. The Union forces advanced steadily, pushing the Confederate troops back and reclaiming the ground that had been lost the previous day. The Confederate retreat. As the Union counterattack gained momentum, the Confederate forces began to retreat. General Beauregard, recognizing that his army was in danger of being overwhelmed, ordered a withdrawal to Corinth. The Confederate retreat was conducted in good order, but it marked the end of their hopes for a decisive victory at Shiloh. The Union pursuit was hampered by the exhaustion of their troops and the difficult terrain, but they managed to inflict additional casualties on the retreating Confederates. By the end of the day, the Confederate army had withdrawn from the field, and the Union forces had secured a hard-fought victory. The aftermath of the Battle of Shiloh was one of the bloodiest engagements of the Civil War up to that point. The Union Army suffered approximately 13,000 casualties, while the Confederates lost around 10,700 men. The high casualty figures shocked both the North and the South and underscored the brutal nature of the conflict. Despite the heavy losses, the Union victory at Shiloh had significant strategic implications. It halted the Confederate advance in the Western theater and paved the way for the Union's eventual capture of Corinth. The battle also demonstrated the importance of effective leadership, coordination, and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances on the battlefield. Chapter 4. Analysis of Key Strategic Decisions. Grant's decision to encamp at Pittsburgh Landing. One of the most critical decisions made by Grant before the Battle of Shiloh was his choice to encamp his army at Pittsburgh Landing. This decision was based on several strategic considerations, including the need to maintain a secure supply line via the Tennessee River and the desire to prepare for an advance on Corinth. However, Grant's decision to encamp at Pittsburgh Landing also had significant risks. The Union Army was spread out over a large area, with divisions positioned in separate camps that were not well fortified. This lack of defensive preparations left the Union forces vulnerable to a surprise attack, which is exactly what happened when Johnston launched his assault on April 6. Grant's failure to fortify his position or establish a more cohesive defensive perimeter has been criticized by some historians, who argue that it contributed to the initial success of the Confederate attack. However, others have pointed out that Grant's decision to hold his ground and organize a defense after the attack began was crucial in preventing a complete Union collapse. Johnston's decision to attack Grant. General Albert Sidney Johnston's decision to launch a surprise attack on Grant's encampment at Pittsburgh Landing was a bold and aggressive move. Johnston recognized the opportunity to strike Grant's army before it could be reinforced and believed that a decisive victory would reverse the Union's gains in the Western theater. Johnston's plan was based on several key assumptions, including the element of surprise and the ability of his troops to execute a coordinated assault. However, the plan was compromised by delays in the Confederate march, poor coordination among the Confederate corps, and the loss of the element of surprise. Despite these challenges, Johnston's decision to attack Grant was not without merit. The Confederate assault initially achieved significant success, driving the Union forces back and inflicting heavy casualties. However, the death of Johnston and the subsequent change in command to Beauregard had a significant impact on the outcome of the battle. Grant's decision to hold his ground. One of the most important decisions made by Grant during the Battle of Shiloh was his decision to hold his ground and organize a defense after the Confederate attack began. Despite the initial confusion and heavy losses, Grant recognized that retreating to the river would leave his army vulnerable to being cut off and destroyed. Grant's decision to hold his ground allowed the Union forces to establish a defensive perimeter and buy time for reinforcements to arrive. The defense of the Hornets' Nest, in particular, played a critical role in delaying the Confederate advance and allowing Grant to reorganize his forces. Grant's ability to remain calm under pressure and make decisive decisions in the heat of battle was a key factor in the Union's eventual victory at Shiloh. His leadership during the battle demonstrated his strategic acumen and his ability to adapt to changing circumstances on the battlefield. Beauregard's decision to halt the attack after assuming command following Johnston's death. General P.G.T. Beauregard made the decision to halt the Confederate attack on the evening of April 6. Beauregard believed that the Union forces were on the verge of collapse and that a final push would secure a Confederate victory. However, he also recognized that his troops were exhausted and in need of rest. Beauregard's decision to halt the attack has been the subject of much debate among historians. Some argue that it was a missed opportunity to deliver a decisive blow to the Union Army, while others contend that the Confederate forces were too disorganized and exhausted to continue the assault. Regardless of the merits of Beauregard's decision, it had significant implications for the outcome of the battle. The pause in the Confederate attack allowed Grant to reorganize his forces and prepare for a counterattack, which ultimately led to the Union victory on April 7. Grant's decision to launch a counterattack on April 7 was a bold and decisive move that demonstrated his aggressive leadership style. Despite the heavy losses suffered by his army on the first day of the battle, Grant recognized that the Confederate forces were also weakened and disorganized. By taking the offensive, Grant aimed to regain the initiative and drive the Confederates from the field. The arrival of Buell's army provided the necessary reinforcements to turn the tide of the battle, and Grant's counterattack was executed with precision and determination. The Union forces advanced steadily, pushing the Confederate troops back and reclaiming the ground that had been lost the previous day. Grant's decision to counterattack was a key factor in the Union's eventual victory at Shiloh. It demonstrated his ability to seize the initiative and exploit the weaknesses of the enemy, even in the face of significant adversity. Chapter 5. The legacy of the Battle of Shiloh. The strategic impact of the battle. The Union victory at the Battle of Shiloh had significant strategic implications for the Civil War. It halted the Confederate advance in the Western theater and paved the way for the Union's eventual capture of Corinth. The battle also demonstrated the importance of effective leadership, coordination, and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances on the battlefield. The high casualty figures at Shiloh shocked both the North and the South and underscored the brutal nature of the conflict. The battle marked a turning point in the war, as both sides realized that the conflict would be long and costly. The impact on Grant's career. The Battle of Shiloh was a defining moment in Ulysses S. Grant's military career. Despite the initial setbacks and heavy losses, Grant's leadership during the battle demonstrated his strategic acumen and his ability to remain calm under pressure. His decision to hold his ground and launch a counterattack ultimately led to the Union victory and solidified his reputation as one of the Union's most effective commanders. However, the battle also brought criticism and controversy. Some in the North blamed Grant for the high casualties and accused him of being caught off guard by the Confederate attack. Despite these criticisms, Grant's superiors, including President Abraham Lincoln, recognized his abilities and continued to support him. The victory at Shiloh set the stage for Grant's rise to prominence and his eventual appointment as the overall commander of the Union armies. The impact on the Confederate war effort. The Confederate defeat at Shiloh was a significant blow to their war effort in the Western theater. The loss of General Albert Sidney Johnston was particularly devastating, as he was one of the South's most experienced and respected commanders. The failure to achieve a decisive victory at Shiloh also undermined Confederate morale and highlighted the challenges they faced in countering the Union's superior resources and manpower. The retreat to Corinth after the battle marked the beginning of a series of setbacks for the Confederates in the West. The Union's eventual capture of Corinth further weakened the Confederate position and set the stage for future Union offensives, including the Vicksburg Campaign. The evolution of military strategy. The Battle of Shiloh also had a lasting impact on military strategy and tactics. The high casualties and the brutal nature of the fighting demonstrated the importance of effective reconnaissance, fortifications, and coordination among different units. The battle highlighted the need for better communication and logistics, as well as the importance of adapting to the realities of modern warfare. The lessons learned at Shiloh influenced the strategies and tactics employed by both sides in subsequent battles. The Union's ability to recover from the initial Confederate assault and launch a successful counterattack demonstrated the importance of resilience and adaptability in the face of adversity. The memory of Shiloh. The Battle of Shiloh has been remembered as one of the most significant and bloody engagements of the Civil War. The high casualty figures and the intense fighting left a lasting impression on those who participated in the battle and on the nation as a whole. The memory of Shiloh has been preserved through numerous accounts, memoirs, and historical studies. The battlefield itself has been designated as a national military park, ensuring that the sacrifices made by both Union and Confederate soldiers are remembered and honored. The Battle of Shiloh was a pivotal moment in the American Civil War, marked by intense fighting, heavy casualties, and critical strategic decisions by both Union and Confederate commanders. The key decisions made by Ulysses S. Grant and Albert Sidney Johnston before and during the battle had a profound impact on its outcome and the subsequent course of the war. Grant's decision to hold his ground and launch a counterattack demonstrated his leadership and strategic acumen, while Johnston's bold plan to attack Grant's encampment highlighted the importance of surprise and coordination in military operations. The battle also underscored the challenges and complexities of warfare, as both sides grappled with the realities of modern combat. The legacy of the Battle of Shiloh continues to be felt today, as it serves as a reminder of the sacrifices made by those who fought in the Civil War and the enduring impact of their decisions on the course of American history. Through the study of this pivotal battle, we gain a deeper understanding of the strategic thinking, leadership, and resilience that defined one of the most critical moments in the nation's history. The impact of Albert Sidney Johnston's death on the Confederate Army's performance. The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, was a defining moment in United States history, pitting the Northern states, the Union, against the Southern states, the Confederacy, in a brutal conflict over issues of states' rights, slavery, and the future of the nation. Among the many figures who played pivotal roles in this conflict, Albert Sidney Johnston stands out as one of the Confederacy's most promising and respected generals. His death at the Battle of Shiloh on April 6, 1862, marked a turning point in the war, particularly for the Confederate Army's performance in the Western theater. This article explores the life and career of Albert Sidney Johnston, the circumstances surrounding his death, and the profound impact his loss had on the Confederate war effort. Albert Sidney Johnston, a brief biography. Early life and military career. Albert Sidney Johnston was born on February 2, 1803, in Washington, Kentucky. He was the youngest son of Dr. John Johnston and Abigail Harris Johnston. From an early age, Johnston exhibited a strong sense of duty and a desire for a military career. He attended Transylvania University in Lexington, Kentucky, before receiving an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1822. Johnston graduated from West Point in 1826, ranking 8th in his class. His early military career included service in the Black Hawk War, 1832, and the Texas Revolution, 1835 to 1836. Johnston's leadership skills and bravery earned him a reputation as a capable and reliable officer. He resigned from the U.S. Army in 1834 to care for his ailing wife, Henrietta Preston, but returned to military service in 1836, joining the Army of the Republic of Texas. Service in the Republic of Texas. During his time in Texas, Johnston served as the Republic's Secretary of War and played a crucial role in organizing and training its military forces. His efforts helped secure Texas's independence from Mexico and laid the groundwork for its eventual annexation by the United States in 1845. Return to the U.S. Army and the Mexican-American War. With Texas's annexation, Johnston rejoined the U.S. Army and served with distinction during the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848. He was brevetted for gallantry at the Battle of Monterey and later served as a staff officer under General Winfield Scott during the campaign to capture Mexico City, the Utah Expedition, and the approach of Civil War. In 1857, Johnston was appointed commander of the U.S. Army's Department of Utah, where he led the Utah Expedition, also known as the Mormon War, to suppress a rebellion by Mormon settlers. Although the conflict was resolved without significant bloodshed, Johnston's leadership during this period further solidified his reputation as a competent and decisive commander. As tensions between the North and South escalated in the late 1850s, Johnston found himself torn between his loyalty to the United States and his Southern heritage. When the Civil War broke out in April 1861, Johnston resigned his commission in the U.S. Army and offered his services to the Confederacy. Johnston's role in the Confederate Army appointment as a Confederate general. Upon joining the Confederacy, Johnston was quickly recognized as one of its most experienced and capable officers. In September 1861, he was appointed a full general in the Confederate Army, one of only 8 men to hold that rank during the war. Johnston was given command of the Western Theater, which encompassed a vast area stretching from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River. Challenges in the Western Theater. The Western Theater was a critical front for the Confederacy, as it included key transportation routes, agricultural resources, and industrial centers. However, the region also presented significant challenges for Confederate forces. The Union Army of the Tennessee, under the command of General Ulysses S. Grant, was making steady advances into Confederate territory, capturing strategic locations such as Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in early 1862. Johnston faced the daunting task of organizing and defending a sprawling and poorly supplied Confederate army. His forces were outnumbered and outgunned by the Union troops, and the Confederate government in Richmond often prioritized the Eastern Theater, where General Robert E. Lee was leading the Army of Northern Virginia. The Battle of Shiloh in early April 1862, Johnston launched a bold offensive against Grant's army, which was encamped at Pittsburgh Landing, Tennessee, near a small church called Shiloh. Johnston hoped to catch Grant by surprise and deliver a decisive blow that would halt the Union advance and secure Confederate control of the Western Theater. The Battle of Shiloh, fought on April 6 to 7, 1862, was one of the bloodiest engagements of the Civil War up to that point. Johnston's forces initially achieved significant success, driving back Union troops and inflicting heavy casualties. However, the Confederate advance was slowed by stiff Union resistance, and Johnston himself was mortally wounded on the afternoon of April 6. The death of Albert Sidney Johnston. The fatal wound. Albert Sidney Johnston's death at Shiloh was both dramatic and tragic. On the afternoon of April 6, Johnston led a charge against Union positions near the Peach Orchard, a key sector of the battlefield. During the assault, Johnston was struck in the back of the knee by a bullet, severing an artery. Unaware of the severity of his wound, Johnston continued to lead his troops until he began to feel faint from blood loss. Johnston's staff officers quickly realized the gravity of the situation and attempted to provide medical assistance. However, the general had sent his personal physician to attend to wounded Union prisoners earlier in the day, and no tourniquet was immediately available. Johnston bled to death within minutes, becoming the highest-ranking officer on either side to be killed in action during the Civil War. Immediate aftermath. The news of Johnston's death sent shockwaves through the Confederate ranks. His loss was a devastating blow to the morale of the Confederate Army, which had been on the verge of a significant victory. Without Johnston's leadership, the Confederate attack lost momentum, and Union reinforcements under General Don Carlos Buell arrived overnight to turn the tide of the battle. On April 7, Grant launched a counterattack that forced the Confederates to retreat. The Battle of Shiloh ended in a Union victory, with both sides suffering staggering casualties. The Confederates lost approximately 10,700 men, while the Union suffered around 13,000 casualties. The impact of Johnston's death on the Confederate Army. The death of Albert Sidney Johnston had profound and far-reaching consequences for the Confederate Army's performance in the Western Theater. Johnston was widely regarded as one of the Confederacy's most capable generals, and his loss left a leadership vacuum that proved difficult to fill. Leadership vacuum. Johnston's successor, General P.G.T. Beauregard, was a skilled and experienced officer, but he lacked Johnston's strategic vision and ability to inspire his troops. Beauregard's decision to withdraw from Shiloh rather than continue the fight was controversial and contributed to a sense of disillusionment among Confederate soldiers. In the months following Shiloh, the Confederate Army in the West underwent a series of command changes, with generals such as Braxton Bragg, John C. Pemberton, and Joseph E. Johnston taking turns at the helm. None of these commanders were able to replicate Johnston's success or restore the Confederate Army's momentum in the Western Theater. Strategic setbacks. Johnston's death also had significant strategic implications for the Confederacy. Without his leadership, the Confederate Army was unable to mount an effective defense against Union advances in the West. Over the next 2 years, Union forces under Grant, William T. Sherman, and others captured key Confederate strongholds such as Vicksburg, Chattanooga, and Atlanta, effectively splitting the Confederacy in two and cutting off vital supply lines. The loss of the Western theater had a cascading effect on the Confederate war effort. As Union forces gained control of the Mississippi River and penetrated deep into the South, the Confederacy's ability to sustain its armies and maintain its economy was severely compromised. The fall of Vicksburg in July 1863, coupled with the Union victory at Gettysburg, marked a turning point in the war and set the stage for the eventual collapse of the Confederacy. Morale and cohesion. Johnston's death also had a detrimental impact on the morale and cohesion of the Confederate Army. Johnston was a respected and beloved figure among his troops, and his loss was deeply felt. Many Confederate soldiers viewed Johnston as their best hope for victory in the West, and his death left them demoralized and uncertain about the future. The lack of a clear and consistent command structure in the Western theater further eroded morale. Confederate soldiers often found themselves under the command of generals who were either inexperienced, indecisive, or at odds with one another. This lack of cohesion and direction made it difficult for the Confederate Army to mount effective counteroffensives or respond to Union threats. The long-term consequences of Johnston's death. The collapse of the Western theater. The death of Albert Sidney Johnston marked the beginning of a steady decline in the Confederate Army's performance in the Western theater. Over the next 2 years, Union forces under Grant and Sherman systematically dismantled Confederate defenses and captured key strategic points. The fall of Vicksburg in July 1863 was a particularly devastating blow, as it gave the Union control of the Mississippi River and effectively split the Confederacy in two and cutting off vital supply lines. The loss of the Western theater had a cascading effect on the Confederate war effort. As Union forces gained control of the Mississippi River and penetrated deep into the South, the Confederacy's ability to sustain its armies and maintain its economy was severely compromised. The fall of Vicksburg in July 1863, coupled with the Union victory at Gettysburg, marked a turning point in the war and set the stage for the eventual collapse of the Confederacy. Morale and cohesion. Johnston's death also had a detrimental impact on the morale and cohesion of the Confederate Army. Johnston was a respected and beloved figure among his troops, and his loss was deeply felt. Many Confederate soldiers viewed Johnston as their best hope for victory in the West, and his death left them demoralized and uncertain about the future. The lack of a clear and consistent command structure in the Western theater further eroded morale. Confederate soldiers often found themselves under the command of generals who were either inexperienced, indecisive, or at odds with one another. This lack of cohesion and direction made it difficult for the Confederate Army to mount effective counteroffensives or respond to Union threats. The long-term consequences of Johnston's death. The collapse of the Western theater. The death of Albert Sidney Johnston marked the beginning of a steady decline in the Confederate Army's performance in the Western theater. Over the next 2 years, Union forces under Grant and Sherman systematically dismantled Confederate defenses and captured key strategic points. The fall of Vicksburg in July 1863 was a particularly devastating blow, as it gave the Union control of the Mississippi River and effectively split the Confederacy in two. The loss of the Western theater had far-reaching consequences for the Confederate war effort. Without access to the resources and transportation routes of the West, the Confederacy struggled to supply its armies and maintain its economy. The Union's ability to project power deep into the South also undermined Confederate morale and weakened the resolve of Southern civilians. The impact on Confederate strategy. Johnston's death also had a significant impact on Confederate strategy. Prior to Shiloh, Johnston had advocated for a more aggressive approach in the Western theater, emphasizing the importance of taking the fight to the Union and securing key strategic points. His death left the Confederate High Command without a clear and unified strategy for the West, leading to a series of disjointed and ultimately unsuccessful campaigns. In the absence of Johnston's leadership, Confederate strategy in the West became increasingly reactive and defensive. Generals such as Braxton Bragg and John C. Pemberton focused on holding key positions rather than taking the initiative against Union forces. This defensive posture played into the hands of Union commanders like Grant and Sherman, who were able to exploit Confederate weaknesses and gradually grind down their defenses. The human cost. The death of Albert Sidney Johnston also had a profound human cost. Johnston was one of the Confederacy's most experienced and capable generals, and his loss deprived the Confederate Army of a leader who could have potentially altered the course of the war. While it is impossible to know for certain how the war might have unfolded had Johnston survived, his death undoubtedly weakened the Confederate war effort and contributed to the eventual Union victory. Johnston's death also had a personal impact on those who knew and served under him. Many Confederate soldiers and officers mourned the loss of a leader they respected and admired. Johnston's death was a stark reminder of the brutal and unforgiving nature of the Civil War, and it served as a sobering moment for both sides. The legacy of Albert Sidney Johnston. Historical assessments. In the years since the Civil War, historians have debated the impact of Albert Sidney Johnston's death on the Confederate Army's performance. Some have argued that Johnston's loss was a critical turning point in the war, while others have suggested that the Confederacy's defeat was inevitable. Regardless of Johnston's fate, those who view Johnston's death as a pivotal moment point to his leadership skills, strategic vision, and ability to inspire his troops. They argue that Johnston's presence could have made a significant difference in key battles such as Shiloh, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga, potentially altering the course of the war. Others, however, contend that the Confederacy's defeat was the result of broader structural and logistical factors, such as the Union's superior resources, industrial capacity, and manpower. From this perspective, Johnston's death, while significant, was not the decisive factor in the Confederate defeat. Johnston's place in Confederate memory. Regardless of the historical debate, Albert Sidney Johnston remains an important figure in Confederate memory and Civil War history. He is remembered as a brave and capable leader who gave his life in service to the Confederate cause. Johnston's death at Shiloh has been romanticized in Southern lore, and he is often held up as a symbol of the lost cause, a narrative that portrays the Confederacy as a noble but doomed effort to defend states' rights and Southern heritage. Johnston's legacy is also reflected in the numerous monuments, memorials, and place names dedicated to him throughout the South. These tributes serve as a testament to the enduring impact of his life and career, as well as the complex and often contentious ways in which the Civil War is remembered in American history. The death of Albert Sidney Johnston at the Battle of Shiloh was a pivotal moment in the American Civil War, with profound and far-reaching consequences for the Confederate Army's performance in the Western theater. Johnston's loss left a leadership vacuum that proved difficult to fill, and his absence contributed to a series of strategic setbacks that ultimately undermined the Confederate war effort. While the full impact of Johnston's death is a matter of historical debate, there is no doubt that his loss was a significant blow to the Confederacy. Johnston's leadership, strategic vision, and ability to inspire his troops were qualities that the Confederate Army sorely missed in the years following his death. As the war progressed, the absence of a leader of Johnston's caliber became increasingly apparent, and the Confederate Army's performance in the Western theater suffered as a result. In the end, the death of Albert Sidney Johnston serves as a poignant reminder of the human cost of war and the profound impact that individual leaders can have on the course of history. Johnston's legacy endures as a symbol of the sacrifices made by those who fought in the Civil War, and his story continues to be a subject of fascination and reflection for historians and Civil War enthusiasts alike. The long-term effects of the Battle of Shiloh on the Civil War. The Battle of Shiloh, fought on April 6 to 7, 1862, near Pittsburgh Landing in Tennessee, was one of the bloodiest engagements of the American Civil War up to that point. It marked a significant turning point in the conflict, with far-reaching consequences that would shape the course of the war and its aftermath. This article explores the long-term effects of the Battle of Shiloh on the Civil War, examining its impact on military strategy, political dynamics, and the broader social and economic landscape of the United States. The strategic importance of Shiloh. The Western Theater and the road to Shiloh. The Western Theater of the Civil War was a critical arena where Union and Confederate forces vied for control of key territories, rivers, and railroads. The capture of Forts Henry and Donelson in February 1862 by Union General Ulysses S. Grant had opened the Tennessee River to Union forces, allowing them to penetrate deep into Confederate territory. The Confederate response was to concentrate forces at Corinth, Mississippi, a vital railroad junction, in an attempt to halt the Union advance. The Battle of Shiloh, a tactical overview. The Battle of Shiloh began as a surprise Confederate attack on Grant's encamped army at Pittsburgh Landing. Despite initial successes, the Confederates, led by General Albert Sidney Johnston and later by General P.G.T. Beauregard, were unable to dislodge the Union forces. Reinforcements under General Don Carlos Buell arrived overnight, and the Union counterattacked the next day, forcing the Confederates to retreat. The battle resulted in over 23,000 casualties, a staggering number that shocked both sides. The immediate aftermath. The Union victory at Shiloh secured their hold on western Tennessee and opened the way for further advances into Mississippi. However, the high casualty rate and the near defeat of Grant's army led to widespread criticism and calls for his removal. Despite this, President Abraham Lincoln stood by Grant, recognizing his tenacity and strategic acumen. The evolution of military strategy. The shift to total war. The Battle of Shiloh marked a shift in the nature of the Civil War, as both sides began to recognize the necessity of total war, a strategy that targeted not only enemy armies but also the economic and social infrastructure that supported them. The high casualties at Shiloh demonstrated that the war would not be won through a few decisive battles, but would require a prolonged and brutal struggle. The rise of Grant and Sherman. Shiloh was a turning point in the careers of several Union generals, most notably Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman. Despite the criticism he faced, Grant's performance at Shiloh solidified his reputation as a determined and resourceful commander. Sherman, who had initially been dismissed as unstable, proved his mettle during the battle and would go on to become one of the Union's most effective generals. The Confederate leadership crisis. The death of General Albert Sidney Johnston at Shiloh was a significant blow to the Confederate cause. Johnston was one of the South's most experienced and capable commanders, and his loss left a leadership vacuum that the Confederacy struggled to fill. The subsequent reliance on less experienced generals contributed to the eventual decline of Confederate military fortunes. Political repercussions. The impact on Union morale and public opinion. The high casualties at Shiloh shocked the Northern public and led to a decline in morale. However, the Union victory also demonstrated that the war would be a long and costly struggle, reinforcing the determination of many Northerners to see the conflict through to its conclusion. The battle also had a polarizing effect on public opinion, with some calling for a more aggressive prosecution of the war and others advocating for a negotiated peace. The Confederate response, mobilization and conscription. The Confederate defeat at Shiloh underscored the need for greater mobilization of resources and manpower. In response, the Confederate government implemented conscription, a controversial measure that exacerbated tensions between the central government and the states. The draft also led to widespread resistance and desertion, further weakening the Confederate war effort. The Emancipation Proclamation and the shift in war aims. The Battle of Shiloh occurred at a time when the Union was grappling with the question of slavery and its role in the war. The high casualties and the realization that the war would be prolonged contributed to a shift in Northern war aims. In the months following Shiloh, President Lincoln began to consider emancipation as a strategic necessity, culminating in the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863. This marked a significant turning point in the war, transforming it from a conflict to preserve the Union into a struggle for freedom and equality. Social and economic consequences. The human cost, casualties and their aftermath. The Battle of Shiloh was one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War, with over 23,000 casualties. The sheer scale of the loss had a profound impact on the communities from which the soldiers came. The battle also highlighted the inadequacies of medical care and logistics, leading to reforms in both areas as the war progressed. The impact on slavery and African Americans. The Union victory at Shiloh and the subsequent advance into the Deep South had significant implications for slavery. As Union forces moved deeper into Confederate territory, they encountered increasing numbers of enslaved people seeking freedom. This posed a challenge for Union commanders, who had to decide how to handle the influx of refugees. The experience at Shiloh and other battles in the Western theater contributed to the growing recognition that the war was fundamentally about slavery, and that its abolition was essential to the Union's success. Economic dislocation and the war's toll on the South. The Battle of Shiloh and the Union's subsequent campaigns in the Western theater had a devastating impact on the Southern economy. The destruction of infrastructure, the loss of manpower, and the disruption of trade routes all contributed to the economic collapse of the Confederacy. The war also exacerbated existing social tensions, leading to increased resistance to Confederate authority and contributing to the eventual defeat of the South. The legacy of Shiloh. The battle's place in Civil War memory. The Battle of Shiloh has occupied a prominent place in the memory of the Civil War. For many, it symbolizes the brutality and cost of the conflict, as well as the determination and sacrifice of those who fought. The battle has been the subject of numerous books, films, and other cultural works, reflecting its enduring significance in American history. Shiloh and the evolution of military medicine. The high casualties at Shiloh exposed the inadequacies of Civil War-era medical care. The battle led to significant advancements in battlefield medicine, including the development of more effective triage systems, the use of ambulances, and improvements in surgical techniques. These innovations would have a lasting impact on military medicine and civilian healthcare. The battle's influence on future conflicts. The lessons learned at Shiloh had a profound influence on future military conflicts. The battle demonstrated the importance of logistics, intelligence, and the need for a coordinated strategy. It also highlighted the devastating impact of modern weaponry on traditional tactics, foreshadowing the evolution of warfare in the 20th century. The Battle of Shiloh was a pivotal moment in the American Civil War, with far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond the battlefield. It marked a turning point in the conflict, shaping the strategies, politics, and social dynamics of the war. The battle's legacy is evident in the evolution of military tactics, the transformation of the war's aims, and the profound impact on the lives of those who fought and those who lived through the conflict. As we reflect on the long-term effects of Shiloh, we gain a deeper understanding of the Civil War's complexity and its enduring significance in American history. The Battle of Shiloh and its influence on the public perception of Ulysses S. Grant. The Battle of Shiloh, fought on April 6 to 7, 1862, in southwestern Tennessee, was one of the bloodiest engagements of the American Civil War up to that point. It marked a turning point not only in the war itself but also in the public perception of Ulysses S. Grant, one of the most prominent Union generals. This battle, which resulted in a Union victory, had profound implications for Grant's career, reputation, and legacy. In this article, we will explore how the Battle of Shiloh influenced the public perception of Ulysses S. Grant, examining the immediate aftermath, the media coverage, the political ramifications, and the long-term impact on Grant's military career and historical legacy. The prelude to Shiloh. The early stages of the Civil War. The American Civil War began in April 1861. And by early 1862, the Union and the Confederacy were locked in a brutal struggle for control of the Mississippi River and the Western theater of the war. Ulysses S. Grant, a relatively unknown officer at the outbreak of the war, had already begun to make a name for himself with his victories at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in February 1862. These successes earned him the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant and brought him to the attention of President Abraham Lincoln and the Union High Command. Grant's rise to prominence. Grant's early successes in the Western theater were crucial in establishing his reputation as a capable and aggressive commander. His ability to secure key victories at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson demonstrated his strategic acumen and his willingness to take risks. However, these victories also set high expectations for Grant, and the pressure was on for him to continue delivering results. The strategic importance of Shiloh. The Battle of Shiloh was part of a larger Union strategy to gain control of the Mississippi River and split the Confederacy in two. The Union forces, under Grant's command, had established a foothold in southwestern Tennessee at Pittsburgh Landing, near the Shiloh Church. The Confederate Army, led by General Albert Sidney Johnston, sought to launch a surprise attack on Grant's forces to drive them back and regain the initiative in the Western Theater. The Battle of Shiloh. The Confederate surprise attack. On the morning of April 6, 1862, the Confederate Army launched a surprise attack on Grant's forces at Pittsburgh Landing. The Union troops were caught off guard, and the initial Confederate assault was devastating. The fighting was fierce, and the Union lines were pushed back towards the Tennessee River. Grant, who was not present at the front lines when the attack began, quickly rushed to the scene to take command. Grant's leadership during the battle. Despite the initial setbacks, Grant's leadership during the Battle of Shiloh was crucial in turning the tide of the battle. He remained calm under pressure and worked to reorganize his forces, establish defensive positions, and coordinate reinforcements. Grant's ability to maintain his composure and make quick decisions in the heat of battle was a testament to his military skill and leadership. The arrival of reinforcements. One of the key factors in the Union's eventual victory at Shiloh was the arrival of reinforcements under the command of General Don Carlos Buell. These fresh troops helped to stabilize the Union lines and allowed Grant to launch a counterattack on the second day of the battle. The Confederate forces, exhausted and low on ammunition, were unable to withstand the Union assault and were forced to retreat. The aftermath of the battle. The Battle of Shiloh was a costly victory for the Union, with over 13,000 Union casualties and nearly 11,000 Confederate casualties. The sheer scale of the bloodshed shocked the nation and led to widespread criticism of Grant's leadership. Many questioned whether the high cost of the victory was justified, and some even called for Grant's removal from command. The immediate aftermath and public reaction. Media coverage of the battle. The Battle of Shiloh was one of the first major battles of the Civil War to receive extensive media coverage. Newspapers across the North and South reported on the battle, often with sensationalized accounts of the fighting and the casualties. The graphic descriptions of the carnage at Shiloh shocked the public and led to a wave of criticism directed at Grant. Criticism of Grant's leadership. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, Grant faced intense criticism from both the press and the public. Many accused him of being caught off guard by the Confederate attack and of failing to properly prepare his troops for the possibility of an assault. Some even suggested that Grant had been negligent in his duties and that his lack of preparedness had led to the high number of Union casualties. Political ramifications. The criticism of Grant's leadership at Shiloh also had political ramifications. Some members of Congress and the Union High Command called for Grant's removal from command, arguing that he was unfit to lead. President Abraham Lincoln, however, stood by Grant, famously stating, "I can't spare this man, he fights." Lincoln's support was crucial in keeping Grant in command and allowing him to continue his military career. Grant's response to the criticism. Grant was deeply affected by the criticism he faced after Shiloh, but he remained determined to prove his critics wrong. He continued to lead his troops with the same aggressive and determined style that had brought him success at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. Grant's resilience in the face of adversity would eventually help to restore his reputation and solidify his place as one of the Union's most important generals. The long-term impact on Grant's career. Grant's continued success in the Western theater. Despite the criticism he faced after Shiloh, Grant continued to achieve success in the Western theater of the war. His victories at the battles of Vicksburg and Chattanooga further demonstrated his military skill and helped to restore his reputation. By the time Grant was promoted to the rank of lieutenant general and given command of all Union armies in 1864, he had firmly established himself as one of the Union's most capable and effective commanders. The turning point in public perception. The Battle of Shiloh marked a turning point in the public perception of Ulysses S. Grant. While the initial reaction to the battle was overwhelmingly negative, the long-term impact of Shiloh on Grant's career was ultimately positive. The battle demonstrated Grant's ability to lead under pressure and to make difficult decisions in the heat of battle. As Grant continued to achieve success on the battlefield, the public began to view him in a more favorable light, and the criticism he faced after Shiloh began to fade. Grant's legacy as a military leader. The Battle of Shiloh played a crucial role in shaping Grant's legacy as a military leader. The lessons he learned at Shiloh, particularly the importance of preparation and the need to remain calm under pressure, would serve him well in future battles. Grant's ability to learn from his experiences and to adapt to changing circumstances was a key factor in his success as a commander, and it helped to cement his place in history as one of the greatest military leaders of the Civil War. The historical significance of Shiloh. The impact of Shiloh on the Civil War. The Battle of Shiloh was a pivotal moment in the Civil War, with far-reaching implications for both the Union and the Confederacy. The Union victory at Shiloh helped to secure control of the Western theater and paved the way for future successes, such as the capture of Vicksburg and the eventual Union victory in the war. The battle also demonstrated the importance of logistics, preparation, and leadership in modern warfare, lessons that would be applied in future conflicts. The human cost of Shiloh. The Battle of Shiloh was one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War, with over 23,000 casualties on both sides. The sheer scale of the bloodshed shocked the nation and brought home the brutal reality of the war. The human cost of Shiloh served as a stark reminder of the sacrifices made by both Union and Confederate soldiers, and it helped to galvanize public opinion in the North and the South. The legacy of Shiloh in American history. The Battle of Shiloh holds a significant place in American history, not only for its impact on the Civil War but also for its influence on the public perception of Ulysses S. Grant. The battle marked a turning point in Grant's career and helped to shape his legacy as a military leader. The lessons learned at Shiloh, both in terms of military strategy and leadership, continue to be studied and applied by military historians and leaders to this day. The Battle of Shiloh was a defining moment in the Civil War and in the career of Ulysses S. Grant. While the initial public reaction to the battle was overwhelmingly negative, the long-term impact of Shiloh on Grant's career and legacy was ultimately positive. The battle demonstrated Grant's ability to lead under pressure and to make difficult decisions in the heat of battle, qualities that would serve him well in future conflicts. As Grant continued to achieve success on the battlefield, the public began to view him in a more favorable light, and the criticism he faced after Shiloh began to fade. The Battle of Shiloh also had a profound impact on the course of the Civil War, helping to secure Union control of the Western theater and paving the way for future victories. The human cost of Shiloh served as a stark reminder of the sacrifices made by both Union and Confederate soldiers, and it helped to galvanize public opinion in the North and the South. In the end, the Battle of Shiloh was a turning point not only in the Civil War but also in the public perception of Ulysses S. Grant. The lessons learned at Shiloh, both in terms of military strategy and leadership, continue to be studied and applied by military historians and leaders to this day. The legacy of Shiloh and its impact on Grant's career and reputation remain an important part of American history, and they serve as a reminder of the complexities and challenges of leadership in times of war. The main challenges faced by the Union and Confederate armies during the Battle of Shiloh. The Battle of Shiloh, fought on April 6 to 7, 1862, in southwestern Tennessee, was one of the bloodiest engagements of the American Civil War. It marked a turning point in the conflict, as it demonstrated the scale and ferocity that the war would eventually take. The battle pitted the Union Army of the Tennessee, commanded by Major General Ulysses S. Grant, against the Confederate Army of Mississippi, led by General Albert Sidney Johnston and, after Johnston's death, General P.G.T. Beauregard. Both sides faced significant challenges that influenced the outcome of the battle and provided valuable lessons for the remainder of the war. This article will explore the main challenges faced by the Union and Confederate armies during the Battle of Shiloh, including logistical difficulties, command and control issues, terrain and weather conditions, and the psychological toll of combat. Logistical challenges. Union Army. The Union Army faced significant logistical challenges in the lead-up to the Battle of Shiloh. Grant's forces were operating deep in Confederate territory, far from their supply bases. The Army of the Tennessee had established a forward base at Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River, but this location was vulnerable to attack and difficult to supply. The Union relied heavily on river transport to move troops, ammunition, food, and other supplies, but the riverine system was not always reliable, especially during the spring rains that characterized the region. Supply lines. The Union supply lines were stretched thin, and the Army struggled to maintain a steady flow of provisions. The roads leading to Pittsburgh Landing were often muddy and impassable, making it difficult to transport supplies overland. This logistical strain was compounded by the fact that Grant's army was still in the process of organizing and equipping new regiments, many of which were inexperienced and poorly supplied. Ammunition shortages. During the battle, Union troops faced critical shortages of ammunition. The rapid rate of fire during the intense fighting depleted reserves quickly, and resupply efforts were hampered by the chaotic nature of the battle. At several points, Union soldiers were forced to scavenge ammunition from fallen comrades or retreat to the rear to replenish their supplies. Medical support. The Union Medical Corps was ill-prepared for the scale of casualties at Shiloh. Field hospitals were overwhelmed, and there was a severe shortage of medical supplies, including bandages, medicines, and surgical instruments. Many wounded soldiers were left untreated for hours or even days, leading to unnecessary suffering and death. Confederate Army. The Confederate Army also faced significant logistical challenges, many of which were exacerbated by the South's limited industrial capacity and transportation infrastructure. Supply shortages. The Confederate forces were chronically short of supplies, including food, ammunition, and uniforms. Many Confederate soldiers marched into battle at Shiloh with inadequate rations and worn-out equipment. The lack of standardized uniforms also made it difficult to distinguish between friend and foe during the chaotic fighting. Transportation issues. The Confederates relied heavily on railroads to move troops and supplies, but the Southern rail network was underdeveloped and prone to breakdowns. The rapid advance of the Confederate Army toward Shiloh strained the already fragile transportation system, leading to delays and shortages. Artillery limitations. The Confederate artillery was outgunned by the Union's more numerous and better-equipped batteries. Confederate gunners often lacked sufficient ammunition and were forced to conserve their fire, reducing their effectiveness on the battlefield. Command and control issues. Union Army. The Union Army faced several command and control challenges during the Battle of Shiloh, many of which stemmed from the inexperience of its leadership and the rapid expansion of its forces. Grant's leadership. While Ulysses S. Grant would later prove to be one of the Union's most effective commanders, at Shiloh, he was still relatively inexperienced in handling large-scale engagements. Grant's decision to concentrate his forces at Pittsburgh Landing without constructing adequate defensive works left his army vulnerable to a surprise attack. Additionally, Grant's headquarters were located too far from the front lines, making it difficult for him to maintain situational awareness and issue timely orders. Coordination between units. The Union Army at Shiloh was a patchwork of different divisions and brigades, many of which had never fought together before. This lack of cohesion led to confusion and miscommunication during the battle. For example, the failure of Union forces to establish a unified defensive line on the first day of the battle allowed the Confederates to exploit gaps and achieve local breakthroughs. Reinforcement delays. The arrival of Major General Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio was critical to the Union's eventual success at Shiloh, but the coordination between Grant and Buell was far from seamless. Delays in communication and misunderstandings about the timing and location of Buell's reinforcements nearly cost the Union the battle. Confederate Army. The Confederate Army also struggled with command and control issues, many of which were rooted in the inexperience of its leadership and the ad hoc nature of its organization. Johnston's death. The death of General Albert Sidney Johnston on the first day of the battle was a significant blow to the Confederate cause. Johnston was the senior Confederate commander and had been instrumental in planning and executing the surprise attack on the Union forces. His death left the Confederate Army in the hands of General P.G.T. Beauregard, who lacked Johnston's aggressive instincts and strategic vision. Lack of coordination. The Confederate attack on the first day of the battle was poorly coordinated, with individual brigades and divisions advancing at different times and in different directions. This lack of synchronization allowed the Union forces to regroup and mount a stubborn defense. Additionally, Beauregard's decision to halt the Confederate advance on the evening of April 6 gave the Union valuable time to reorganize and bring up reinforcements. Communication breakdowns. The Confederate Army suffered from frequent communication breakdowns, both between units and between the front lines and headquarters. Orders were often delayed or misinterpreted, leading to confusion and missed opportunities. For example, The failure to exploit the Union's vulnerable left flank on the first day of the battle was partly due to a lack of clear communication between Confederate commanders. Terrain and weather conditions. The terrain and weather conditions at Shiloh presented significant challenges for both armies, influencing the course of the battle and contributing to the high casualty rates. Union Army. Dense woodland. The battlefield at Shiloh was characterized by dense woodland, which limited visibility and made it difficult for Union commanders to maintain control over their forces. The thick underbrush also hindered the movement of troops and artillery, slowing down Union counterattacks and making it difficult to establish cohesive defensive lines. Muddy ground. The spring rains had turned the ground into a quagmire, making it difficult for Union troops to maneuver and for artillery to be repositioned. The muddy conditions also exacerbated the logistical challenges faced by the Union Army, as supply wagons and ambulances struggled to navigate the treacherous terrain. River obstacles. The Tennessee River, while providing a vital supply route for the Union, also posed a potential obstacle in the event of a retreat. The narrow landing at Pittsburgh Landing became a bottleneck as Union troops and supplies crowded the area, creating a vulnerable target for Confederate artillery. Confederate Army. Difficult terrain. The Confederate advance was hindered by the same dense woodland and muddy ground that challenged the Union forces. The thick underbrush made it difficult for Confederate units to maintain formation and coordinate their attacks, leading to fragmentation and disorganization. Weather conditions. The weather on the first day of the battle was hot and humid, adding to the physical strain on Confederate soldiers, many of whom had marched long distances to reach the battlefield. The heat and humidity also contributed to the rapid exhaustion of troops and the spread of disease in the Confederate camps. Limited visibility. The dense woodland and rolling terrain limited visibility for Confederate commanders, making it difficult to assess the overall situation and coordinate large-scale maneuvers. This lack of visibility contributed to the piecemeal nature of the Confederate attacks and the failure to exploit key opportunities. Psychological toll of combat. The Battle of Shiloh was one of the first major engagements of the Civil War to demonstrate the psychological toll of modern combat. Both Union and Confederate soldiers faced the horrors of large-scale, close-quarters fighting, which left a lasting impact on those who survived. Union Army. Shock of surprise attack. The Union Army was caught off guard by the Confederate surprise attack on the morning of April 6. Many Union soldiers were still in their camps, eating breakfast or preparing for the day, when the Confederate assault began. The suddenness and ferocity of the attack caused panic and confusion among some Union units, leading to a breakdown in discipline and cohesion. High casualties. The sheer scale of the casualties at Shiloh was unprecedented in American military history up to that point. Union soldiers witnessed the gruesome effects of rifle and artillery fire at close range, including dismemberment, decapitation, and other horrific injuries. The sight of so many dead and wounded comrades had a profound psychological impact on the survivors. Fatigue and exhaustion. The two-day battle placed immense physical and mental strain on Union troops, many of whom fought for hours without rest or respite. The constant noise of gunfire, the screams of the wounded, and the sight of dead bodies piled high created an atmosphere of unrelenting stress and exhaustion. Confederate Army. Initial success and subsequent frustration. The Confederate Army achieved significant success on the first day of the battle, driving Union forces back to the Tennessee River. However, The failure to deliver a decisive blow and the arrival of Union reinforcements on the second day led to frustration and demoralization among Confederate troops. High casualties. Like their Union counterparts, Confederate soldiers faced the grim reality of large-scale casualties. The loss of comrades and the sight of so much death and destruction took a heavy psychological toll. The death of General Johnston, a beloved and respected leader, further demoralized the Confederate ranks. Retreat and defeat. The Confederate retreat on the second day of the battle was a bitter pill to swallow for many soldiers, who had fought bravely and believed victory was within their grasp. The realization that their efforts had been in vain, coupled with the physical and emotional exhaustion of the battle, left many Confederate soldiers disheartened and disillusioned. The Battle of Shiloh was a brutal and costly engagement that highlighted the challenges of waging war on a large scale. Both the Union and Confederate armies faced significant logistical, command, and terrain-related difficulties, as well as the psychological toll of combat. The lessons learned at Shiloh would shape the strategies and tactics of both sides for the remainder of the Civil War, as commanders sought to overcome these challenges and achieve victory on the battlefield. Despite its high cost in human lives, the Battle of Shiloh marked a turning point in the war, demonstrating the determination and resilience of both Union and Confederate soldiers in the face of unimaginable hardship.